James Burnham is a conservative author whose works have seen a renaissance in popularity on the right. Of particular note is The Managerial Revolution, which I believe R.N. McIntyre is an exponent of. However, he also wrote a book later in his life called Suicide of the West, which is something of a polemic against what he considers to be, quote-unquote, liberalism. And by liberalism, he doesn't mean the ideology of the Founding Fathers. Rather, he means basically what rightists mean when they say shitlib. I will go over his definition of liberal later on and speak about how unsatisfactory I find it. But that aside, this book represents, for me at least, the last gasp of conservatism. It was an opportunity for conservatism to define itself, to articulate its principles, its aims, its desires, in contradistinction to the left. But unfortunately, it has been disappointing in that regard. Fair enough, I thought, maybe I'll just read it as a critique of certain leftist trends of thought. But on that front, it fell short as well, as there's very little in the way of substantive critique of the positions of this liberalism. Burnham is happy to list what he thinks liberals believe, but he will not deign to perform the task of actually individually refuting each and every one. This book reads as though it were a puff piece for conservative egos, something of a shibboleth of self-importance rather than a genuine work of political reasoning or intellectual curiosity. On my channel, I often critique conservatism. I made a 45-minute long video called The Problem with Conservatism very early on, and it's worth scrolling down and watching if you can ignore the fact that I set the music volume a little bit too high. I've critiqued conservatism socially as well, which has been a theme of my past few videos. But now I want to take on some of the themes of this book in particular. It has regularly appeared to me, and to some others, that conservatism lacks any genuine principles. I'm always looking for something of substance in conservative writing. I looked in vain for positive ideology in Christopher Lasch. I've tried to find any foundational principles or principled arguments in Pat Buchanan and ultimately found it lacking. I've looked far and wide for a conservative content creator who has an ideological backbone, and I've come up with a list of exactly 0 people. I am continually disappointed by the inability of conservatives to produce a serious literary and intellectual background to their worldview, and I'm sorry to say that James Burnham has disappointed me too. So what are the principles of the conservative worldview? We can surmise that conservatives want to conserve something, but what is that? Conservatives will sometimes say tradition, and as James Burnham himself elucidates to us, by tradition, he simply means customs, such as the seniority rule in the selection of congressional speakers. By customs, he does not mean principles, but rather he is referring specifically to the irrational accretions of daily rote behaviors done almost thoughtlessly. As a result, a conservative can co-sign the loss of every element of a genuinely traditional society that has been jettisoned, such as the divine right of kings, the spiritual authority of priests, the mixture of political and religious authority in the church, or in other words, the lack of separation between church and state, the aristocracy and system of castes, as well as the tradition of agrarianism and smallholding that was so common in the late Middle Ages. A conservative is not a reactionary, after all. So long as we conform to stiff and arbitrary conventions that may have been invented at any point in time for any purpose, like teaching your children nursery rhymes or having turkey for dinner on Thanksgiving Day, we can be said to be conserving tradition. We might look at this in another way and say that what conservatives are conserving is the state of society. So as a result, the primary job of a conservative is to say no to change. But since society, regardless of attempts to freeze it, does indeed organically change, we can see that conservatism as a program is a failure. Every decade of conservatism tries simply to conserve the status quo of the last decade, and what that status quo is keeps changing. I addressed this problem in my video, Why Conservatism Can't Conserve Anything. The fundamental problem I'm getting at here is that the definition of tradition adopted by conservatives, including Burnham, is an incoherent one. If we say tradition is custom, then not only is our adherence to it sometimes irrational and groundless, and so we would be forced by defending tradition into defending irrationality, or simply defending the norm because it is the norm. But also we must be forced to defend things and behaviors that are only peripheral to society. What tradition actually is our living relationship to divine principles and values. If this is true, then the conservative dichotomy between tradition and change is obviated as artificial. Tradition, since it is a relationship and not necessarily any particular structure or behavior, can survive despite the existence of social, theological, and political change. Tradition is simply a reference point, a center around which all activity should be based. Rather than defending custom, which is a mere contingency, we should be defending a connection of our daily behaviors to that absolute traditional center. Individual customs cannot survive change, but our basic connection to our Creator, as well as the basic system of sacraments, teachings, and blessings constituted by religion, can survive change. It has survived 2 millennia of change, in fact, even as our customs and political institutions have waned or evolved. Because conservatism defines what is in reality on the periphery as central, it cannot ever cause the necessary reorientation of society toward what is necessary, nor can it even cause a genuine return to form. This is, in part, why it can, without any irony, proclaim that bourgeois morality, labor and labor ethics, rugged self-reliance, and cultural phenomena such as football or baseball are tradition. Julius Evola spoke at length the degree to which this conservative phenomenon of the sublimation of values into avenues such as sports and labor was an evasion and a deviation, an abdication away from the task of defending what genuinely is tradition. And of course, these deviations force us into a literalistic reactionism. We must resist social improvement because it requires changes and reforms. We must hold on to the bourgeois way of life because it dominated 70 years ago. We must accept free market capitalism because we have had no alternative. We must resist having a vision for the future and must make the future a cautious reflection of the past, rather than to discern what was present in it, what is present in all time and in all periods, and to put it into stark and radical relief against modernity. We then arrive at Burnham's attempt to define liberalism. He is very confused by liberalism since he sees it at once as a symptomatology or a physiognomics, as Spengler might call it, similar to what Umberto Eco tried to do with his fascism, as well as an ideology. Burnham begins, liberalism is not a specific idea or an intellectual school like Spinozism, but rather it is a syndrome. It has many symptoms, such as a plastic doctrine of human nature, universalism, egalitarianism, democratism, reformism, rationalism, secularism, and internationalism. It can be traced back to a whole panoply of thinkers such as John Stuart Mill, René Descartes, Francis Bacon, Saint-Simon, Proudhon, Karl Marx, Adam Smith, and John Maynard Keynes. Liberalism is also what it isn't. It's not a doctrine of the small state. It's not a doctrine of freedom. It's not a doctrine of individualism. But at the same time as it is a syndrome, liberalism is an ideology, which Burnham defines akin to the way Marx used the term to denote a self-serving set of premeditated prejudices that reinforces a political interest. We will return to this view on ideology later. As such, individualism is both a constellation of impulses and symptoms, but also a coherent set of premeditated beliefs. Burnham holds both views to be true without any irony, and so it is not surprising that he is somewhat confused as to what liberal means. Of course, I don't have to say that if an author cannot provide you with a positive definition of that which he is critiquing, he is simply critiquing a straw man, which is left deliberately vague so he doesn't have to anticipate a rebuttal nor concretely engage with any intellectual propositions. It's much easier to just dismiss intellectual propositions as ideology than it is to actually engage with them. That's why most of us who are concerned with questions of ideology and political theory understand liberal to mean a person who believes in the philosophy of natural individual rights, democratic rule, liberty, capitalism, and also a certain pastoral attitude of state, or the argument that the state exists to secure the pursuit of happiness or the well-being of individuals, whatever that might actually mean. These principles often clash with each other, but nonetheless, that's what liberalism is. And since we can identify what liberalism is according to positive principles, we can critique it and also differentiate it from other things. What Burnham is basically doing is, despite being a liberal, exempting himself from liberalism, calling himself a non-liberal, alongside figures such as William F. Buckley and Leo Strauss, no non-liberals, of course, for having a conservative and Republican point of view. But since conservatism is a liberal political view, much of what Burnham critiques is actually inspired by the very foundation of his own politics. The principles of 1789 were liberty, equality, fraternity. The Constitution of the United States, the same republic that Burnham's non-liberals support according to its original intent, begins with all men are created equal. The separation of church and state is an original doctrine of the Founding Fathers, who themselves were largely secular as deists and Freemasons. Thus we can blame them, not the modern-day liberals, for the tendency for modern American society to be dominated by an atheistic point of view. Almost every sin Burnham sees in his liberal opponents are sins that exist in himself, somewhere latent in his worldview. Burnham critiques the growth of the state's power and its overreach into our personal lives, while at various points in his career has defended limiting the right of communists to speak and has cooperated with the CIA in psychological warfare. He is a proponent both of small government and geopolitical imperialism, which is to say a form of internationalism or globalism. He proclaims to value spirituality and tradition, but he supports capitalism, which prizes inquisitiveness, materialism, cupidity, and deception above all other values. Capitalism, of course, is just the mirror image of communism, and so as Evelyn noted, it tends to valorize more or less the same values. All that I have said in my critiques of liberals applies to Burnham, so it is bizarre that he sees liberals as something distinct from himself and his colleagues. What conservatives and self-described liberals disagree over is in fact very paltry. There is only a difference in flavor between the internationalism of liberals and the doctrines of the neoconservative Leo Strauss, for example. And this brings me to my greater overall point, which is that what Burnham sees to be true of liberalism is in fact true of conservatism as well. We can grant that modern shitlibism is kind of a vague constellation of political positions, but that which purports to be its opposite is as well, partly because it is genuinely just oppositional, or to put it in another way, quote-unquote, reactionary, if you will forgive the heterogeneity of that term. Conservatism, as Burnham himself distinctly admits, is devoid of principles. If there are no organizing principles for conservatism, then conservatism is logically simply a syndrome, as he has defined, alongside liberalism with various symptoms, such as support for foreign wars, Zionism, preference for free market capitalism, a desire for strict social controls, as well as a contradictory impulse toward individual liberty. Burnham puts ideology and reality into opposite categories. Liberalism is ideological, and as such it is based on presuppositional rational assumptions about reality that are immune from testing or invalidation. As such, an ideology, as Burnham defines it, is simply an ex post facto justification for one's preferences. The lofty skies of rational discursive ideology are contrasted by him with the hard reality of testable things in the world, which is that which is measurable and provable. So you can see that Burnham believes that the composite parts of an ideology cannot be truth claims or even be falsifiable. In reality, ironically enough, ideologies do coalesce around testable truth claims. The historical materialism of Marx is falsifiable by the events of history, and it certainly has been falsified. Racism is falsifiable as well, since racists make truth claims about the nature of human differences. Anti-Semitism can be falsified too, since one can cross-reference the beliefs and actions of Jewish political actors and determine what outcomes their influences had. Every effigy of ideology that Burnham offers proves to actually be testable or falsifiable in some way, so his assertion that ideology consists solely of epistemically isolated presumptions is clearly false. What Burnham is doing here is simply trying to excuse his conservatism for having a lack of an intellectual tradition. No one has articulated a base of principles for conservatism, and so no one can really differentiate between who is a true conservative and who isn't. No one can claim to be conservatism trademark. No conservative is sure of what he really supports, and so he can be persuaded to support this or that alternatively without any sanity test. Since it's so nebulous, anyone and anything can be conservative, which means that conservatism in reality is nothing. That is the price of lacking an ideology, and fundamentally what Burnham criticizes liberalism for, having no central book or document that defines it, is especially true of conservatism. As such, conservatism is something of a moving target. Every decade we have to critique it anew because it will have arrived at different positions. And this poses a serious problem for those who wish to prevent change or preserve a societal status quo, as conservatives so often opine that they do. Without principles, how can we define a foundation away from which society can be subverted? What sense is there in opposing reform and change when you cannot be sure that what you actually have today is genuinely conservative? This lack of principle is all the more deadly to conservatism than it is to this liberalism, and Burnham has been too blind and self-important to see that. This book does have a singular good chapter, which is when he discusses the feeling of guilt that often motivates shitlibs. Shitlibs feel guilty when they see oppression because they know that they do not personally suffer from this oppression. This leads to them denigrating anyone who enjoys relative comfort or privilege to a pathological extent. Burnham contrasts liberal guilt, which has no mechanism of absolution, with the Christian guilt of original sin, which is remediated through repentance and the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. As a result, Christians tend not to feel so much guilt when they see that they are better off than someone else, because there is an end to the kind of guilt that they feel. There's also a bit of actually good discourse about the concept of white guilt here, although it doesn't go by that name in 1964. Burnham points out how liberals always complain about the legacy of white colonialism and support any group engaged in decolonization, but when non-whites start colonizing each other, they remain completely silent. And of course, liberals have nothing to say about the violence that South Africans have committed against white people. Naturally, though, this didn't make Burnham any more racially conscious. But I must say one thing about this liberal impulse toward guilt. One can state that it, within certain limits, is actually kind of healthy. We would intuitively react with more revulsion if we saw a rich executive driving his Lamborghini through a poor neighborhood, deigning not to help them out and merely flaunting his wealth. I think a CEO should genuinely feel guilty for that, ostentatiously flaunting his wealth without lifting a hand out to help those less fortunate than he. The liberal motivation to help the poor, the vulnerable, and the needy is laudable, and one of the worst traits of conservatism is that it tends to manifest in a self-righteous kind of egoism that wouldn't in reality be out of place in a Reddit atheist with his satanic verses. I am well off, so no one should expect my help, says the conservative. I made it, and it isn't my problem, so I don't care, he says. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. This blatant lack of empathy among conservatives is one of their worst traits, and is why there is a significant plurality of support for liberals among white people. They want to support the people who are supporting the people. Liberals may have too extensive a sense of brotherhood, but conservatives have no sense of brotherhood. They are merely individualists. They cannot countenance the importance of feeling an obligation toward another, especially their countrymen and co-racials. I will steal the following analysis from the traditionalist Charles Upton. If liberalism is the feminine principle taken to its extreme and isolated from the masculine principle, then conservatism is the masculine principle taken to its extreme and cut off from the feminine principle. A healthy society is both action and feeling, both self-development and empathy. One without the other is a recipe for injustices. Burnham, an opponent of any form of welfare or social security, and a proponent of the wasteful hoarding of wealth in the hands of billionaires for the sake of differentiation and freedom, demonstrates his egoic lack of empathy for the poor and downtrodden when he lionizes Skid Row. The ghetto is a good thing, actually, says the conservative. Really, the following passage should speak for itself. Skid Row is the end of the line, and there must be an end of the line somewhere. It is the state of those individuals who by destiny or choice drop out of normal society, even out of criminal society, which is, after all, part of the normal order of things. Most of these individuals are alcoholics, and some are drug addicts. Where they are is Skid Row, and Skid Row exists in every city and always has. In the natural course of events, when the process is not interfered with by ideologues relentlessly determined to solve problems, the citizens of Skid Row usually gather together in one particular district of each town and city. In New York, it was the Bowery, as everyone knew, the most famous of America's Skid Rows. That district is always frightfully run down. It has cheap bars selling rotten liquor, and cheap stores selling even rottener liquor substitutes. Flop houses offering flea-bitten cots for a few cents a night. Greasy hamburger joints. Vacant lots where bonfires can be made of old boards and packing boxes. A 10th-rate pawn shop or two. Sagging doorways where the cops won't bother a man while he sleeps off his drunk. A commercial blood bank where you can sell a pint of blood every month or so if you don't have an active disease. A dreary Catholic church, and 2 or 3 evangelical chapels in old loft buildings. A Salvation Army station where you can get some soup or stew in exchange for singing hymns. A city-run flop house where you can have, when the mood strikes you now and then, a delousing and a shower, along with a plate of food and a bed for the night.
What is the reason for his lionization of Skid Row?
In its own way, Skid Row is an ingenious product of the long and accidentally intricate natural evolution of the city. In society as it really is, hierarchical and differentiating, not equalized or regimented, there has to be an end of the line. The localization of Skid Row and the growth of its distinctive institutions and customs are gradual developments serving to take care of those in need at the end of the line in a way that recognizes the reality of the condition, makes appropriate exceptions to the usual social rules, has a certain warmth and humaneness, along with exits left open for those, they are not many, who wish to take one, and shields the rest of society from Skid Row's potentially destructive effects.
So in the end, he acknowledges that Skid Row is nothing but a debtor's prison, a place of punishment for those who are incapable of, for whatever reason, functioning in normal society. How good is it that the rest of society never has to witness these people, sequestered away in a dark corner, because otherwise they might feel some empathy for their condition and feel a desire to help them, to provide them with a living. Considering the obscene degree of excess wealth accumulated by capitalists, speculators, and investors, there is no reason, other than the purely egoic desire to possess all of one's property regardless of societal obligations, that the people of Skid Row must live like this. One objection Burnham raises for Social Security is the problem of freedom, that Social Security taxes infringe on his rights. But what rights? Do you have a right against taxation? The conservative clearly does not believe that people are entitled to unlimited possession of the fruits of his labor, or rather the fruits of their speculation and paper shuffling. He is perfectly happy to affirm tariffs or income taxes for the sake of supporting Israel's mercenary army. He only draws the line at welfare. In his mind, it is just when the government spends money to kill people. It is a flagrant violation of his personal liberties if the government spends money to help people. Why can't this end of the line be much more humane and pleasant? Why does the end of the line for his social Darwinism have to be the anus of the world? We must also analyze Burnham's framing that allowing the people of Skid Row to be impoverished and to suffer is consonant with the principle of hierarchy and differentiation. In a very literal sense, this might be true, that allowing society's dropouts to hit rock bottom places them in a certain position on a wealth hierarchy, and by virtue of the fact that the reasons why people drop out boils down to differences, or deficiencies, if you will, in character. But in the first place, we have to acknowledge that differentiation in terms of wealth or income is not real differentiation, and it's definitely not what traditional societies meant by differentiation. And contrariwise, an effort to eliminate Skid Row in no way requires us to ignore hierarchy nor differentiation. No one except maybe an outright communist is arguing that the most impoverished, society's dropouts, should be elevated to the station of kings. Those of us, both on the left and the Christian right, who view poverty as a remediable suffering, believe simply that dropouts should have a right to have a reasonable standard of living. In other words, we want dropouts to at least have an equivalent standard of living to members of the working class, and for the working class, we want them to be able to at least afford to sustain their lives and perhaps acquire a few luxuries in the process. In short, we can maintain our system of quote-unquote castes as long as we get rid of the untouchable category. None of this requires us to completely equalize income or redistribute wealth to all people absolutely equally, such as by, for example, establishing a 100% inheritance tax or a 90% tax on the highest earnings. A welfare system can, and in most countries actually does, respect gradations of income. The reality is that most people on welfare can barely afford to pay rent. By no means are they kings, but they can still make a living. There is still an incentive available to those who can stomach it to climb their way up a career ladder. In this way, differentiation is respected as well. If we were to declare that simply because one's personal character is unsuited to life under industrial capitalism, that one should simply be left to starve, then clearly we have demonstrated a flagrant disregard for human life and for the inner souls that animate us as humans. For a Christian to advocate for social Darwinism is a contradiction in ideals. Further, we can see how laughable Burnham's position really is when he recounts his observation of a poor black worker who made a living moving boxes. For those of you in my audience, we can ignore the race question, just mentally swap out black worker for white worker when I'm making my points. But regardless, Burnham admired this worker's singular dedication to lifting boxes and his pride at being a lowly box mover. So much for the high things in life. He noted that the man probably did not make more than $1.25 an hour, which was the minimum wage in 1964, which is apparently about $10 in today's money. He would have been quite impoverished, certainly unable to afford home ownership. It's worth noting that Burnham, like many laissez-faire conservatives, also disapproves of the minimum wage, so in reality, he would want this worker to make even less. Burnham notes that this man's IQ was somewhere near to the floor, and argued that if the minimum wage were raised, he simply wouldn't have a job at all. Thus, slave-tier wages and useless menial jobs are actually a good thing, because at least you're employed. This is similar in tone to the acerbic and cynical argument sometimes made by libertarians and free market conservatives that the sweatshop is a sign of civilizational progress and a kind of alms for the poor by providing them jobs. Sure, sweatshop workers endure terrible working conditions, deadly hours that span the entirety of a day from sunrise to sunset, below subsistence wages, and an inhumane pace of work, and in the most infamous cases, such as at the Foxconn plants, has caused so many suicides that they had to install suicide nets. But the sweatshop does employ people, at least. Only a conservative can see any value in the sweatshop, since for him, work is its own reward. But for the people who actually work in them, who are suffering in despair, who want for 3 square meals a day, a reasonable standard of working conditions, if not a home and some luxuries too, clearly this does not suffice. The sweatshop is a place of suffering where modern serfs work around the clock, where their labor is exploited, and where they are underpaid. It is for rational cause that middle-class conservatives typically sneer and look down upon those stuck performing rote and miserable manual labor, thankful that they are not in such a position. The sweatshop is good, but retirement is better, says the conservative without any measure of cognitive dissonance. Clearly, then, work is not its own reward, since every conservative desires secretly to be rid of it. Must poverty truly be a punishment? So what if this box mover lost his job? This would not be a problem if there is some system of welfare to compensate for the loss. If we accept Burnham's framing, we are left with an artificial dichotomy between people being paid an unlivable wage in menial jobs versus forced jobless poverty.
No alphabet, not even numerals.
Because we must accept the demand for small government, which is an alien government that cannot compensate for the problems caused by the free market nor put any limit on the degree to which capitalists are allowed to deracinate and desiccate society of its values, let alone put their wealth to constructive use. As a result, we are no freer under a small government than a large one. The workplace itself is a synecdoche. Anarchist writer Bob Black has quoted, "There's more freedom in any moderately de-Stalinized dictatorship than in a modern workplace. Nowhere is your behavior more regulated, your opinions more controlled, and your livelihood more dependent on authority than in the workplace." What problems conservatives have with welfare are really only those same problems which are evident in a free market job. But at least on welfare, you don't have to wear a uniform. In either case, you're dependent on and subject to power. It's only a difference of whether it is a private or public tyranny. In truth, a conservative will license any tyranny and any injustice so long as it is private or the result of cultural evolution. When it occurs to us that humans have volition, that we might be able to change things, a stodgy conservative like Burnham says no simply out of reactionary intransigence and prejudice. He will frame suffering as natural and improvement as utopian. What's utopian about a social safety net? Many countries have one. The burden is on Burnham to show why the elimination of Skid Row is impossible and why it would simply result in moving it elsewhere. If it's a race problem, then it's a race problem, but Don't argue that your fellow whites should be deprived of help simply because they can't compete in our fast-paced and highly demanding world, an industrial world, I might add, that does little in the way of ensuring men self-sufficiency. And of course, let us not forget Burnham singing the praises of a barely employed mental retard who moved dogs in and out of kennels at an animal shelter. The bourgeois value of self-reliance must be so thorough for Burnham that he cannot even countenance the possibility of society providing and caring for a literal mental retard. He must be put to work like everyone else. He ruminates that liberals would get the retard fired from his job with a report to the government. But should we really be employing retards? Are you serious? Are they not entitled to society's generosity for their condition? What would happen if he did, indeed, lose that job for some reason? Should he be left to starve? This is short of simply recommending that he should be executed, which of course is the end logic of social Darwinism. Clearly, he cannot rely on himself to survive, since he can hardly do a simple menial job. In our competitive world, he would be passed over for other, more competitive candidates. That is, unless you think those darn liberal protections like the ADA are wrong. Regardless, it is not realistic to expect a literal mental retard to pull himself up by his bootstraps. I really shouldn't have to say that. The rest of this book is more strained physiognomics of liberalism, as well as a bunch of whataboutism in regard to communism, as well as a bunch of miscellaneous and outdated Cold War yapping. Really, it's a lot of hot air. I found myself simply skimming through the later pages as they're so devoid of any actual arguments or intellectual investigations. In the end, he concludes that the Marxist theory of dialectics is really just communists can do whatever they want if it's in service to communism, if you want something of a thermometer for the intellectual rigor of this book. I really wanted to see the best in conservatism. Maybe there was something I missed a couple of years ago when I made my video on it. But no, conservatism is and always will be what it presents itself as, an inhuman and schizophrenic pile of political impulse.